Although many of Blyton's students believed he chose San Francisco as the order's headquarters because of some preternatural knowledge that the city was to be a vital nexus of planetary spiritual activity, the center of whatever new religion was going to happen, it is just as credible that he was simply in the right place at the right time. Cultural alienation had a long and distinguished history in the San Francisco Bay Area. The city had attracted outcasts and misfits, visionaries and utopians since the mid-19th century. It was in the beat scene of the city's North Beach neighborhoods that the counterculture's first alternative philosophies and lifestyles began to emerge in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The national notoriety gained by writers such as Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Alan Watts, Gary Snyder, and Jack Kerouac spread the movement's antinomian rejection of middle-class morality, its new aesthetic and emotional insights into the nature of human experience, its rebellion against the dehumanizing effects of modern technology, and its experiments with hallucinogens and Eastern mysticism through the country's college campuses and coffee houses. As the Beat's message increasingly caught the public fancy, national attention began to focus on San Francisco, itself as a center of lifestyle innovation and cultural creativity. Some spoke of a San Francisco Renaissance, of which the Beat movement was only an epiphenomenon. By mid-decade, San Francisco had become the spearhead for a cultural style and value system that in significant ways controverted the norms of mainstream America. The city's growing number of participants in this cultural rebellion saw in the legitimation crisis affecting the major institutions of American society an opportunity, even an imperative, to explore alternative values and behaviors in politics, theology, religious worship, education, family life, psychology, performance arts, and fashion. Radical political action committees like the Diggers epitomize the prevailing counterculture impulse to level hierarchies and devolve leadership into the rank and file, the people. It was never clear to most commentators just who was and who was not a Digger, let alone who was a leader in the group. This and other people's movements in San Francisco created an alternative economy based on barter, cooperative ownership, and a rejection of affluence and competitive free enterprise. They also organized social welfare projects that used donated food, clothing, shelter, and labor to serve the community's poor with a minimum of bureaucratic interference. The counterculture's growing suspicion of conventional religious meta-narratives, those overarching structures of principle and myth that had once seemed to control, delimit, and interpret the nation's religious activity, far from disposing of larger questions of value and meaning, intensified them. In response, there arose in the San Francisco Bay Area a multiplicity of groups and teachers offering answers to these questions, some proclaiming their teachings with the same absolutist confidence as traditional religions, others embracing a more fluid, indeterminate, and experientially centered ethos. Each of these groups tended to create its own community of discourse with its own non-transferable principles of self-legitimization, thereby further relativizing and delegitimating all such discourses in the minds of the unconverted. According to social historian Annie Gottlieb, these new religious movements, for all their differences, had three features in common. The first of these was a renewed emphasis on the individual as the primary focus of sacred authority and revelation, whereas normative religions in America taught that their respective scriptures and hierarchies were the divinely ordained sources of revelation for the faithful. The new groups privileged the little glimpses of guidance and intuition available every day through private meditation and prayer. The second common feature of these groups was their unabashed borrowing from non-Christian religious traditions and their synthesis of culturally unrelated teachings and practices. This hyper-eclecticism followed in the wake of major advances in information and transportation technology that made access to the cultural resources of East and West available to an ever-widening public. Self-styled religious leaders of the decade such as Lee Lozowick, Samuel Lewis, Ram Dass, and Dafri John encouraged the idea of a global spiritual heritage and ventured to interpret it for their followers. The third common feature of the emerging religious movements was their elevation of the feminine principle to a position of equality or supremacy vis-a-vis the masculine principle, and their concomitant opening of religious leadership positions to women. This development was not surprising, for as Robert Elwood has shown, a common trait of emergent or alternative religions throughout American history has been their acceptance of feminine leadership and feminine images of deity. What was surprising were the long-term reverberations of this development in the nation's religious mainstream. By the early 1990s, over 100 women had been ordained as Reformed Jewish rabbis, over 1,070 women had been ordained as Episcopalian priests and deacons, and over 1,350 Lutheran, 900 Southern Baptist, 4,700 United Methodist, and 2,400 Presbyterian women had become ministers. The crisis of legitimacy in institutions of higher education centered on student frustration with what was seen as an excessively abstract and utilitarian approach to pedagogy and overly specialized academic disciplines. The high college dropout rate bore witness to the widespread belief that universities educated students primarily to perpetuate American capitalism rather than to lead fulfilling and spiritually nurturing lives. The popularity in the San Francisco Bay Area of humanistic psychology and Eastern religious perspectives seemed directly related to their grounding of knowledge and immediate experience, the emotionally moving, all-embracing aesthetic continuum common to all things and all persons. San Francisco's performance arts subculture also embraced a style that found its primary truth in the tangible experience of the moment. Popular performance groups such as the Mime Troupe and the Merry Pranksters thrived on subverting the traditional dramatic canons of plot, character, and setting, instead creating an experience of radical indeterminacy, ephemerality, and immediacy wherein the audience became a creative participant in whatever performance unfolded. The psychedelic happenings orchestrated in the city's streets and parks celebrated spontaneity, surrender to the moment, diversity of expression, and a seemingly random array of colors, sounds, and images. The ballroom rock extravaganza sponsored by promotional companies such as the Family Dog featured such dramaturgical elements as sacred dance, ornate costume, and a collage of images projected onto walls, ceiling, and floor, all of which had the effect of blurring the boundaries between performer and audience and decentering the stars on stage. A new aesthetic of the fragment, which thrived on the severing of materials from their original contents and the reassembling of these fragments into new arrangements, appeared in the fashions and artwork of the hippie movement. These colorful creations epitomized the counterculture's reassessment and appreciation of the artifacts of popular culture and its obsession with surface, novelty, and style for style's sake. This aesthetics of pastiche and montage mirrored the eclecticism that was coming to dominate the city's religious and philosophical culture. By 1966, Haight-Ashbury, the small, relatively isolated neighborhood of quaint Victorian-style houses, flanked by the wooded hills of Ashbury Heights, had become the mecca of the hippie counterculture. Thousands of apartments in the neighborhood had been transformed into crash pads, each typically providing a home for from 5 to 8 permanent and as many as 20 transient residents. Haight Street itself hosted a picturesque collection of exotic characters. One man wore a door knocker strung around his neck and would not speak unless one knocked first. Another wore a poncho with one of his arms sticking out of one sleeve and a plastic doll's arm sticking out of the other. New businesses such as the Psychedelic Shop, the Blushing Peony, and the I Thou Coffee Shop hung colorfully painted signs on their storefronts and mounted old theater seats in their windows so patrons could sit and watch the passing parade. Tourist buses crawled up the ever-crowded street, giving local residents time to hawk their underground papers and wares. By the beginning of 1967, there was a growing sense on the streets of the Haight that some kind of radical breakthrough, a consciousness revolution that reconciled the spiritual, the psychological, and the political, was at hand. At the January 12th press conference announcing the Human Be-In, this expectation was articulated in the characteristic argot of the neighborhood. A union of love and activism will finally occur ecstatically when Berkeley political activists and hip community and San Francisco's spiritual generation and contingents from the emerging revolutionary generation all over California meet for a gathering of the tribes for a human be-in. Now in the evolving generation of America's young, the humanization of the American man and woman can begin in joy and embrace without fear, dogma, suspicion, or dialectical righteousness. A new concert of human relations being developed within the youthful underground must emerge, become conscious, and be shared so that a revolution of form can be filled with a renaissance of compassion, awareness, and love in the revelation of the unity of all mankind. The following day the Berkeley Barb enthused, "The spiritual revolution will be manifest and proven. In unity we shall shower the country with waves of ecstasy and purification." At the January 14th event itself, speakers proclaimed that a new age of love was coming to birth. The idea of social revolution occurring first at the level of individual human consciousness had been central to Esalen founding vision, and had even been embraced in a secular version by such leaders as the New Left as C. Wright Mills, Herbert Marcuse, Theodore Adorno, and Angela Davis. Abandoning the economic determinism of vulgar Marxism, these thinkers now envision the creation of a new consciousness that would free the bourgeois as well as the working class from the false consciousness of a dehumanized social order at war with itself. Certainly the massive ingestion and the hate of such psychotropic substances as LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline was demonstrating experientially that consciousness was a fluid, multidimensional phenomena that could undergo radical shifts in tone, quality, and depth. In anticipation of the wave of young people that was expected to flood San Francisco that summer, the Council for a Summer of Love released an announcement in May that proclaimed the counterculture's expectant mood in strikingly religious and millenarian metaphors. This summer, the youth of the world are making a holy pilgrimage to our city to affirm and celebrate a new spiritual dawn. The activity of the youth of the nation which has given birth to Haight-Ashbury is a small part of a worldwide spiritual awakening. Our city has become the momentary focus of this awakening. Other voices, especially that of Chester Anderson of the Communications Company, were less sanguine in their assessments of the situation. His street raps and broadsides took on a flavor of impending crisis. 3 weeks after the onset of the post-Easter deluge of youth into San Francisco, he was describing the hate as a ghastly trap with no escape and urging local gurus to go to the kids and teach the way now. The actual number of youths who migrated to the Haight-Ashbury between June and August of 1967 was estimated by police to be roughly 75,000. This massive influx of new residents created severe social problems, the most pressing of which was a chronic housing shortage that filled the streets with thousands of jobless nomadic youths. As early as June 7th, the Juvenile Justice Commission was turning 200 minors a month from the Haight to their families. Another problem that became especially acute as the summer wore on was the widespread use of hard drugs such as heroin and methadone. San Francisco General Hospital reported that the number of drug abusers being treated at its clinic had gone from 150 in February to 750 in July. By August, Haight Street had become Speed Street, with half of the neighborhood's hippies injecting themselves with methadone and 1 in 5 experimenting with heroin. The junkies typically became thieves, and the speed freaks, prone to paranoid and violent hallucinations, turned physically dangerous. This development was accompanied by increasing incidents of premeditated violence, as the Hells Angels and other hard-edge types came to dominate the local drug distribution networks. On August 6, the first gruesome acid murders took place, and members of the Diggers began wearing guns. The August 22 issue of a Haight newspaper responded to these events with a eulogy for 2 murdered dealers that suggested how to stay high without drugs. chanting Om or Hare Krishna, or staring with attention at a candle, or studying ancient or new scriptures, or practicing yoga will keep you high until you can receive alchemical turn-on for free from a friend or magician or guru. Gradually, as the summer of love came to an end and the original hippies moved to urban and rural communities outside the Haight, the neighborhood became a dangerous and fearful place populated by the Hells Angels, alcoholics from Skid Row, drug abusers, and delinquents from the Fillmore ghetto. Within several years, the neighborhood would resemble a disaster area, with many of its flats and houses deteriorated beyond repair, and with its once prosperous shopping area decayed into a garbage-filled district of empty storefronts covered with sheets of plywood. Over 50 small merchants would move off Haight Street between September 1967 and late 1969. The failure of the Haight as a coherent sanctuary for counterculture idealists provided a pool of potential recruits for the small intentional communities that were emerging at the time. The more manageable scale of these communities allowed them to make realistic attempts at building sustainable alternative systems of beliefs and lifestyles for their members. Spiritual movements as diverse as the Sufi Order of the West, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the Unification Church, the Integral Yoga Institute, and the Holy Order of Mans, all of which were able to offer convincing versions of such systems, began to attract a sizable number of the Haight's disillusioned youth population and flourished during the late 1960s. A number of religious and political organizations had mobilized themselves in 1966 to address the Haight's growing problems. Groups like the Diggers and the Provos organized the distribution of free food, clothing, and furniture. For Thanksgiving and Christmas, both institutions and individuals invited the homeless to large halls like that at Hamilton Methodist Church for free dinners. In the first half of 1967, these services expanded greatly. The Haight-Ashbury Legalization Organization, staffed by volunteer lawyers, attempted to help hippies with legal problems related to everything from drug dealing to shoplifting. The Haight Independent Proprietors Job Co-op found temporary employment for a steady roster of 6,000 unemployed youths. The Switchboard was founded to develop responses to a broad array of the neighborhood's social necessities, including the development of schools for hippie children, the creation of crash pad space, and the provision of legal aid and food for newcomers. Huckleberries for Runaways, a cooperative project sponsored by the Methodist Church, the Glide Foundation, the United Church of Christ, and the San Francisco Council of Churches, began providing counseling, runaway location services, and shelter for the homeless. To address the serious health problems resulting from drug abuse, poor nutrition, and sexual promiscuity, a corps of healthcare volunteers founded the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. The clinic would become a neighborhood fixture, providing free medical care for the counterculture on terms that it could accept. Another social service project, located in a small fourth-floor office at 1005 Market Street, opened in the late spring of 1966. The office consisted of two small suites, one of which was set up as a chapel with an altar. A folding sign on the sidewalk by the office's street entrance invited people to come in for a moment of meditation and rest. The facility was open every day from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening. It went largely unnoticed by the journalists and sociological researchers investigating the city's hippie phenomenon. As his co-workers later recalled, Earl Blyton had decided to shift the focus of his spiritual labors from the nice middle-aged people he had taught previously to the growing numbers of counterculture youths wandering the city's streets. His plan was to provide spiritual counseling, temporary housing, classes, and a job placement service for these nomadic dropouts in the hope that they would pull their lives together and make a positive contribution when they re-entered mainstream society. As Blyton himself recounted, in 1966 we saw the great need for working with people, and so we opened a prayer shrine where people might come in off the street for a few moments of quiet or counseling, or where we might feed them in the nearest restaurant. After 3 months of total silence, as no one had approached us, the seed grew, the plant and the rose burst forth, and we were crowded day and night with requests for help. The street chapel was within a few blocks of San Francisco's notorious Tenderloin and Skid Row neighborhoods, which at the time were teeming with young indigents. Blyton and his first students began their service work in this area. They made arrangements with an inexpensive hotel to provide a few nights free shelter for the homeless, and supplied meal tickets that were redeemable at a small local restaurant. Those who were sick or injured were taken to local hospitals, and those who were preparing for job interviews Blyton had arranged were given clean clothing from a rack he kept behind his desk. Within a short time, the increasing volume of requests for assistance led Blyton to borrow money to lease and renovate a rundown hotel at 241 6th Street. This facility, like a similar project run by the Diggers at the nearby Reno Hotel, was used to provide temporary shelter for a transient population whose numbers were reaching crisis proportions citywide. Although Blyton claimed that he had been ordained in 1946 by a spiritualist-affiliated church called the Universal Church of Psychic Science, he usually dressed in an ordinary business suit with a necktie. However, Blyton stopped wearing this conventional attire after the opening of the Market Street Chapel and began dressing in black suits with a white priest collar. Around his neck he put a black onyx cross that had a smaller cross of rose garnets set in it. When he was conducting services in the chapel, he wore a long white robe. Blyton's Tuesday and Thursday evening classes and Sunday worship services began to attract crowds of 30 to 40 people. Most were young men in their late teens and early 20s who had left home, become disillusioned with the counterculture, and were seeking a meaningful social and spiritual identity. By November 1966, 6 of the more committed of these students had decided to pool their resources and rent a 7-room apartment at 39 Guerrero Street, where Master Earl, as Blyton's students now referred to him, would occasionally visit and teach classes. Presently, Blyton directed his students to start wearing black suits that he had procured for them from local thrift stores. He also insisted that they shave, get haircuts, and wear rabatos, priest collars, made from royal blue satin cloth. On the face of it, these requirements do not seem unusual. Religious teachers throughout history have required of their disciples a symbolic sacrifice of their former identities, a sacrifice that often entailed a cutting of hair and donning of some type of religious habit. Blyton's dress code, however, clashed radically with the hang-loose styles of the city's youth, whose preference was for colorful, flowing Eastern-style clothing, long hair, and beards. Many former members recall that they were repelled by this formal religious attire and clean-cut appearance upon their initial contact with the group. Blyton, however, whose overriding purpose at this juncture was to rehabilitate casualties of the counterculture for a useful social role, hoped that this formal dress and grooming code would rekindle in his young followers a sense of dignity and self-discipline that had been lost during their years of chemical abuse, squalid living, and fashionable antinomianism. He also wanted his students to appear in their street work as members of a legitimate Christian charitable organization, so that those in need could identify them. As part of their training, Blyton would take his Guerrero Street students on evening street missions in the Tenderloin district. These missions, which would become a standard feature of the order's curriculum, were envisioned as a kind of practicum in which students applied in concrete crisis situations what they had learned on a theoretical level in classes. Without proselytizing, Blyton and his followers would simply make themselves accessible by their presence and their garb to anyone who might wish help or counseling. During one memorable 3-day period, the brothers, as they began calling themselves, went to Hunter's Point to help the injured during a race riot. They also attempted to spread calm by walking around the troubled neighborhood and visualizing an etheric web of light permeating it. In subsequent years, this unusual practice would become a regular part of the order's street patrols. The nascent group's undertakings were not always successful. Within several months of its leasing, the hotel on Lower Sixth Street had to be returned to its owner because a dishonest night clerk had absconded with the receipts. Though disheartened, Blyton plunged ahead with other service projects. One of these entailed joining forces with a charitable organization of African American women called The Group to distribute used clothing and housewares to the needy. Another was the sponsoring of movies in Golden Gate Park's Hall of Flowers for underprivileged and handicapped children. During the Christmas season, the brothers solicited surplus food and toy donations from neighborhood merchants and delivered Christmas boxes to poor families, whose names they had obtained from local relief agencies. At times during this period, the growing number of students would come for impromptu evening classes at the apartment Blyton shared with his new wife, Ruth, at 700 Sutter Street. They would be served coffee and donuts and sit on the floor. Rather than greeting him as Master Earl, Blyton's followers now began addressing him as father and his wife as mother. This was the beginning of a pervasive discourse of family that was to develop in the movement. Soon the group's centers would be called brother houses and sister houses, the priest's reverend father or reverend mother, the head or heads of a center house father or house parents, and the order itself the brotherhood. Over the years, some of Blyton's students would speak lovingly of him as the only real father they had ever had. As Sam Keene and Robert Bly have convincingly argued, they, like many others, were part of a middle-class generation in search of a father, an elderly male figure who could lead them through an authentic ordeal and initiate them into full psychological and spiritual adulthood. Sociologist Janet Jacobs posits a similar argument, claiming that the growth of patriarchal and charismatically led spiritual communities during the 1960s and 1970s reflected a desire on the part of young adults to experience both the ideal family and the fathering of a protective and loving male authority figure. For Jacobs, this desire stemmed from a pervasive disillusionment with the nature of fathering in American culture. Members of these patriarchal movements were encouraged to see themselves in a childlike relationship to the charismatic father figures. These figures correspondingly assumed parental responsibilities of love, discipline, guidance, and knowledge. As we shall see, Blyton's relationships with his students would closely resemble Jacobs' generic observations. Michael Harris was one of Blyton's early students. He was born in 1951 and reared in a family of stage performers. Harris's first public experience as an actor occurred in a local theater in Clearwater, Florida, when he was 7. By his early teens, his family had moved to New York City and begun a children's theater at the famed La Mama. During his time at the Children's Theater, Harris worked with Bette Midler and a director named Tom O'Borgan. When O'Borgan was asked to direct a new Broadway production called Hair, he asked the 16-year-old actor to audition. Harris became the youngest member of the Tribe, as the cast was called, and sang in the popular duet, "What a Piece of Work is Man." His year on Broadway opened his mind to the civil rights struggle, the war in Vietnam, and the world of psychedelic drugs. During one LSD-induced vision, Harris saw hundreds of hands descending from the sky bearing scrolls that read, "Go to San Francisco." He left the Tribe a short time later and followed his older brother Hibiscus to a commune in the San Francisco Bay Area. Harris immediately became caught up in the city's spiritual ferment and attended meetings and festivals sponsored by the Hare Krishna movement. He also began to suffer again from a hereditary bone disease that required the periodic removal of tumors from his leg. While being treated at Presbyterian Medical Center, Harris met a young order student who told him about Father Blyton. The student mentioned that Blyton was an accomplished spiritual healer and received Harris's permission to discuss his condition with him. The following day, 2 of Blyton's advanced students arrived dressed in clerical garb. They were so pleasant they seemed like angels of salvation, he recalled. The 2 students gave him a broken Christian cross and said it represented Harris's body that would soon be mended. They also asked him to visualize a bubble of light around his hospital bed. Harris performed the exercise and felt washed over with a sense of well-being and relieved of all pain from the operation. Later that evening, after the students had left, Harris was gripped by an intense mixture of despair and post-operative pain. He held the broken cross and called on the Master, Jesus, as the students had suggested. Almost instantly, a soothing presence of light washed away his pain, and he drifted off to sleep. The students returned the next morning and announced that they had heard his call the previous night. This was enough to convince Harris of the authenticity of their spiritual path, and he asked to meet with their teacher. When his doctor gave him the clearance to leave, he was taken to the Brother House and introduced to Blyton. As Harris recalled, they were in the middle of an esoteric council meeting, a meeting of priests and master teachers, which lent the room a supercharged air. I must have looked like a waif of some kind, with my shoulder-length hair and my scarf of moonbeams. Blyton turned to Harris and said, "Hello, son. You can stay with us a while if you want." The young actor would remain with the group for the next 13 years. A similar story would be repeated over and over by the young people who entered Blyton's movement during its founding period. Most of these recruits were non-California natives who had wandered into the San Francisco Bay Area in the mid to late 60s. Lacking secure social roles and strong family ties, the brimming with youthful idealism and a spirit of adventure, these recruits often made snap decisions to join the group, decisions based on nothing more than an intuitive hunch that it was the right thing to do. Blyton's early students and acquaintances claimed that he moved in an aura of mysterious and subtle forces and regularly demonstrated telepathic, healing, and clairvoyant abilities. One of these acquaintances described him as a magical man. He appeared to be, in short, what Robert Elwood has called a magus, a shamanic figure adapted to the conditions of the Western civilized world. As characterized by Mircea Eliade, the shaman is a tribal member who experiences a mysterious call from the gods and undergoes some ordeal or initiatory event that opens his awareness to the spirit worlds. From that time onward, through trance, dance, and special methods of magical manipulation, he is believed able to converse with the gods and the spirits of departed ancestors, to travel in his soul body to the spirit realm, to prophesy, and to heal physical and psychological disease. As described by Elwood, the shaman in civilization has all these capacities and is able to induce powerful ecstatic experience in his followers. In this sense, the magus is akin to Max Weber's mystagogue, whose primary role, unlike that of the prophet who transmits a new ethical doctrine, is that of a performer of sacramental rites that yield tangible benefits for his followers. There is always something mysterious or hidden about such a figure, and he is more a show person and trickster than a saint, savior, or healer. Pythagoras, Paracelsus, Saint Germain, Emanuel Swedenborg, Cagliostro, Helena Blavatsky, and G.I. Gurdjieff were some of the more renowned maguses of history, according to Elwood, who emphasizes the mythic glamours that surrounded these figures. For example, there was typically something unusual about these maguses' births and early lives, and there were large gaps in their personal histories up to the time at which they entered the public arena. Stories of daring exploits in distant lands and meetings with great sages were often circulated by members of the magus' inner circle, and the circumstances of their deaths were shrouded in mystery. These civilized shamans' formal teachings were typically a pastiche of esoteric traditions and practices, yet they predictably portrayed a universe of subtle forces that the maguses seemed able to manipulate, and of multi-tiered planes of reality through which they moved at will. Finally, the maguses of history appeared unbounded by social and ethical norms, and took great delight in dismantling the fixed conceptions of disciples as to how they should or should not act. As befit the aura of mystery that surrounded him, Blyton rarely discussed the details of his life prior to 1966. When he did, his recollections were filled with accounts of bold adventures, charismatic healings, paranormal visitations, and secret initiations. One former student recalled that Blyton told her he was a highly evolved soul who had taken over the body of a 6-year-old youth when the boy was about to die. He allegedly did this so as not to have the strong earthly tie to a mother and father that could later have impeded his spiritual work. Other students remember that Blyton had sometimes intimated in sermons and in private conversations that he had lived in the same body for over 200 years. In these claims, a key aspect of Blyton's personal mythology was being created, one that intimated he had never been born in an earthly sense and had possessed the ability from early youth to travel back and forth between the spiritual and physical worlds. On several occasions, Blyton reportedly hinted of his membership in the Great White Brotherhood, claiming that unlike most initiates in this august fraternity who chose to serve from the inner planes, he was an old roustabout who liked adventure and chose to do his work in a physical body. A close confidant recounted that Blyton had spoken to him on several occasions of his work as a naval intelligence officer. In one such discussion, Blyton told of how he had abandoned his post aboard a Navy ship off the coast of Panama in order to carry out a secret assignment, to locate the son of a prominent official. When he returned, he was imprisoned mistakenly as a deserter until his superiors in Washington could prove the valid authorization for his mission. No official records of this event would ever be found, Blyton added, due to its highly clandestine classification. In a sermon given on November 2, 1969, Blyton spoke of another daring assignment, the background of which was Hitler's destruction of Rosicrucian and Masonic libraries throughout Germany. Working with a secret cadre of Freemasons and Rosicrucians, Blyton had helped deliver 15 tons of books to Germany throughout the lodges that were meeting in the cellars. Blyton also spoke openly of his personal teacher, Ananias, who he claimed had taught him from the spirit realms during his young adulthood. His stories of this training contain motives similar to those found in the lore of such 20th century spiritual figures as Yogananda of the Self-Realization Fellowship and H. Spencer Lewis of AMORC. These included undergoing severe ordeals that unlocked paranormal faculties and learning obedience to the master's guidance at the cost of short-term social embarrassment or financial setback. Another part of the mythology surrounding Blyton had to do with his maverick struggles against the legal establishment. As one ex-member put it, he was having running battles with society back before I was born, and getting thrown in jail for using light machines to heal people, and breaking into Senate hearings and running down the aisle of the courtroom, screaming and telling them what was right and what was wrong, and how this trial was a travesty of justice, and being hauled out of the room with 2 guards on each arm. It's incredible some of the stories about Father Paul, the name by which Blyton was known in the order, and his confrontation with the world. 2 documentary sources, the private memoirs of Blyton's widow, Ruth Blyton, and the transcripts of a trial held on October 3, 1946, in Rochester, New York, offer some corroboration of these assertions. These documents mention Blyton's interest in light therapy while employed by Eastman Kodak, and his invention of an electrical apparatus called the ultra-theory ray machine. The apparatus reportedly irradiated a patient's body with a sequence of colors and was used to help those for whom regular medical treatment was ineffective. After achieving a high record of success, especially with patients suffering from arthritis, Blyton was brought to court by the American Medical Association and convicted of practicing medicine without a license. In the trial's aftermath, the young engineer became a lifelong critic of the AMA's attempts at exclusive control of the healing field and continued his work quietly, advertising only by word of mouth. A large file of affidavits from the 1940s exists attesting to Blyton's success in healing everything from sciatica to palsy. The less mythic details of Blyton's life prior to 1966 are, not surprisingly, rather sketchy. He was born on April 18, 1904, near Rochester, New York, and reared by his mother and English grandmother, his parents having divorced when he was still a boy. The only child, showed early signs of an independent mind in religious matters. He rejected the Free Methodist doctrines of his childhood, which he found overly severe, and began private studies with the Rosicrucian Society and the Freemasons while still a young man. The future teacher would openly discuss his Masonic training in later years and his 32nd degree initiate status. Blyton's early work experience, according to testimony in his 1946 trial, was varied. He was employed as a draftsman and engineered for the General Railway Signal Company and the Rochester Telephone Company, built radio stations for the United States Navy, taught drafting and civil engineering in a vocational school, and designed optical instruments for Graflex and Eastman Kodak. His formal education included graduation from the Monroe Mechanics Institute of Rochester and the United States Navy School of Radio Telephony, and matriculation in psychology, optics, and radiology courses at the University of Rochester. During his trial, Blyton claimed that his light machine was in the process of being patented and that he intended to manufacture and sell it to physicians and naturopaths. At some point in his early adulthood, Blyton married a woman of Roman Catholic background who bore him 3 sons, the youngest of whom, Francis, eventually became a priest. The middle son, Gerald, left home during his teens and joined the Merchant Marines. Of the 3 brothers, he was the only one who later supported his father's religious work in California. Although there is no evidence that Blyton ever became a Catholic himself, he did receive catechetical instruction for a period of time and allowed his children to be reared in the Catholic tradition. During his time in New York, Blyton also attended spiritualist churches and studied the Science of Mind writings of Ernest Holmes. By the spring of 1967, Earl and Ruth Blyton had moved into the Brother House on Guerrero Street. Since it was such a long distance between this location and Market Street, they decided to move the Science of Man Church office to an empty storefront on Dubose Avenue. A chapel was built up in the large room on the ground floor, while the basement was used to store clothing and housewares donations. It was during this period that the order's distinctive symbology began to be developed. A close associate, Orrin Grant, painted a large cross with a circle around the middle point on the wall behind the sanctuary, while Blyton and a student named Matthew Lipa built a wood altar and carved its front side with a circle, a triangle, and a square. A combination of these Christian and Masonic Rosicrucian motifs would in time become the identifying insignia for the Holy Order of Mans. For Blyton, sacred symbolism was a mathematical language, showing how the force and the power of all things operated in the universe. By mastering the use of esoteric symbols on the mental plane, the plane of cause, and by speaking the word of power, students could manifest the material or spiritual conditions they sought in life. Blyton interpreted the circle, square, and triangle as the basic forms from which all other structures in the cosmos were derived. All designs, machines, buildings, the bodies of men, and the things of nature had the same forms in some variation or baseline. The circle symbolized the eternal, infinite Godhead and the unity of all things. The triangle correlated with Blyton's mentalist interpretation of the Christian Trinity and represented the method of scientific prayer, or the 3 steps of the law, the process of creation. In the first step, a person established meditative contact with the Father, the creative life force that was believed to permeate and animate all things. The next step was to draw a mental picture of what was needed or desired, and to ask for this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. The final step, related to the action of the Holy Spirit, was to thank the Father for this gift and to go about one's business with the assurance that what one had prayed for would soon be manifest on the material plane, the realm of the 4 elements, whose symbol was the square. Blyton's universal law of mental dynamics became a central pillar of his early teachings. As articulated in his 1967 treatise, The Golden Force, it was the great formula which the Creator set in the solar pattern of the universe so that his creations would have freedom. Though taught by the Master Jesus, this law was largely unknown to humanity because the Christian churches, in their desire to make people totally dependent on the church hierarchy, had omitted it from their instruction. Blyton came to believe that part of the order's mission in the present dispensation would be to restore this suppressed knowledge to mainstream Christianity. One of Blyton's associates during the 1966 and 1967 was a spiritualist minister known as Reverend Lusardi. In early 1967, the two teachers began using the Thursday evening class sessions to conduct what were in effect spiritualist seances. The chairs in the chapel were formed into a large circle, the electric lights were replaced by candles, and Blyton and Lasardi took turns giving psychic messages to those in attendance. These sessions gave Blyton's followers first-hand evidence of his perceived ability to receive messages from the spirit world. Within a short time, order members would interpret this capacity as a prophetic charisma by which Blyton received revelations from Jesus Christ. In March, the messages coming through Blyton began to take on an urgent millenarian tone. His listeners were told, "The days of dawdling are over. It is time that we gather the sheep into the fold. It is time that we gather the elite to the house of the King. There are many roads to that great white way, but he, Blyton, is building a new level from which the dark and oppressed may approach, for the days move rapidly." This message was taken to imply that an age of spiritual transformation was at hand for the earth, perhaps even the second coming of Christ, and that Blyton had been divinely ordained to help prepare society's outcasts, the debris of the counterculture, for this new dispensation. Another message received in March hinted at the nature of the coming transformation. For all things, regardless of their consistency, will be changed in density and brought into the light and fullness of the Christos. So let us manifest this and acquire great physical and spiritual strength through the presence of the light within us. The meaning of this message, as it was later articulated to Blyton's students, was that the fulfillment of the new covenant was occurring, a planetary illumination or supercharging of the Earth's psycho-spiritual atmosphere with both the physical solar light and spiritual light of Christ. This raising of consciousness would produce a molecular transformation of the Earth and the human body. In order to live productively within this illumined atmosphere, individuals would need to undergo rapid and intensive spiritual training. The Holy Order of Mans, as subsequent messages declared, was under a divine edict to prepare as many people as possible for this dispensation through the administration of powerful solar initiations by the group's priests. One former student claimed that Blyton's primary motivation in starting his New Age order was his frustration with the slow-paced methods used by traditional schools of initiation, and his belief that the urgency of the times called for an accelerated approach. You could be in a place for 20 years before you would know anything about light. He worked with people so they could come through illumination and realization quicker. The general outline of Blyton's millenarian vision was hardly a point of great originality. Many of the NRMs that emerged in California during the 1960s embraced visions of an impending planetary transformation. However, much of the details and central characters may have differed. The Christian Yoga Church was a case in point. In another example, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, prophesied the end of the present materialistic age, or Kali Yuga, and the imminent appearance of a new age of love and unity. Like the Transcendental Meditation movement, ISKCON believed that the new age would occur first at the level of human consciousness. Once the human mind had been transformed, material conditions would follow suit. In contrast, the Living Word Fellowship, a charismatic Jesus People church, taught that the world was in its last generation and that God would soon destroy urban America by firestorm. The fellowship's members believed that God had commissioned them to build an ark of safety high in the Sierras and to engage in a process of spiritual perfection that would culminate in their dominion over the world during the coming millennium. The Second Coming theme was understood literally in the Meher Baba movement, the Unification Church, and the Divine Light Mission. For these groups, the millennium had already begun with the public manifestation of their respective avatars, Meher Baba, Sun Myung Moon, and Guru Maharaj Ji. The Sufi order of Blyton's friend Samuel Lewis taught that the dawning of a new age could be observed in the increasingly planetary outlook of humanity and in the new social units of Russia, China, Sweden, and Israel, where the group concept was supplanting individualism. For Lewis, the millennium coincided with the arrival of a higher human soul type, one that had more sensitivity, more awareness, more heart. The coming of these New Age souls had been prophesied by such visionaries as Bulwer Lytton, H. G. Wells, Sri Aurobindo, and Hazrat Inayat Khan. Coinciding with their arrival would be the restoration of women to their ancient prerogatives, including oracular and other psychic functions, and the appearance of female hierophants to preside over womankind's own special mysteries. Blyton would come to share Lewis's vision of a restored priestly role for women, though he had initial doubts as to the practicability of training both male and female priests in the same organization. As a woman ordained in 1972 recalled, "I was present when Father explained that it wasn't his desire to do this, but the Master told him that women were ready now and that in the past they had not been. They had not reached a point in the evolution of the female form where it could be possible, but now it needed to be done, and they should take their rightful place. We were the first ones to enter into it, and then others would follow after us." This recounting alludes also to the exemplary dimension that Blyton believed was part of his movement's millennial role. What was being pioneered in the order would have a ripple effect for the entire planet. In keeping with his mentalist philosophy, he taught that all God-inspired activity, from words to gestures to thoughts, created a seed pattern that would one day bear fruit in the world of matter. The first of Blyton's women disciples to receive ordination was his wife Ruth in 1967. The ordination ceremony was choreographed by the teacher's invisible guides, who explained that the ancient rite of female consecration had been one of breaking the ties of all family relationships and of purification at the altar of fire. Facing a group of priests before the altar, the candidate had been given to the realization that she was to serve this priesthood in all ways. In the New Age, however, the process was to be reversed. The woman now would be served and honored by the male priesthood. During the ceremony, Ruth Blyton was given jurisdiction over all matters involving women, children, and marriage in the nascent movement. She was also granted the mantle of mastery by Blyton, which was understood to confer upon her special charismatic and initiatory authority. Finally, after the new priest had been draped in a white stole with a rose on each side, those in attendance came forward to kiss her hand and crown her with yellow roses. This innovative ceremony, which in actuality was more elaborate than what appears above, was only the first of what would become a highly sophisticated set of sacramental rites used by the Holy Order of Mans. Since Blyton claimed that he had received the finished forms of these rituals from the Master Jesus himself, they came to be regarded as sacrosanct and inviolable. It was when the group's leaders began to tamper with these rites in 1984 that many members first realized the radical nature of the changes that were taking place in their movement. The notion of creating a formal religious order began to emerge in the autumn of 1967. For some time, Blyton had considered the idea of turning the Science of Man Church into a seminary where his students could gain accredited ministerial training. At one point, he had even traveled to Sacramento to file incorporation papers to this end. However, state officials had turned down his proposal because the school lacked the required financial resources and state-accredited teachers. At a house meeting a short time later, Blyton's students decided that they were less interested in the church as such and more drawn to the idea of a religious brotherhood organized along the lines of the Jesuits of the Subramaniya Yoga or along the lines of the Jesuits or the Subramaniya Yoga Order. Blyton then formulated a general framework for the community and added the Order of Man as an amendment to the Science of Man Charter on October 23, 1967. There were now 9 committed members living together and a number of interested students who dropped by regularly for counseling, classes, and worship. In November, Blyton began to organize his small community according to a strict monastic pattern. Although an official rule would not be completed for 9 months, a provisional house regulation was established that called for rising at 6 a.m., mandatory attendance at 6:15, communion, and breakfast at 7. Members would then leave for outside jobs or remain behind to work in the house. Blyton made it a cardinal rule that the community be supported solely by the labors of its members. Upon returning from work, the students observed an hour of silent meditation, ate a communal dinner, participated in classes or street mission until 10 p.m., evening prayers, and were in bed by 11 p.m. As part of the complete break with the past that Blyton demanded of his followers, drug use was strictly forbidden, as was rock music, whose beat he claimed would undo in a few minutes the spiritual work he had spent weeks building up. Classical recordings and sacred hymns accompanied by piano were the only music permitted in the household. Between the fall of 1967 and the spring of 1968, the Order of Man continued to attract refugees from the Haight and young adults who had come to San Francisco in search of enlightenment. Although the details of their individual stories were unique, the terminus for many was a decision to join Blyton's community. Martin Swanson, to take one example, was seeking a spiritual teacher when he drove into San Francisco in late 1967. The Chicago native picked up a youthful-looking hitchhiker named Eric Fuchs, who was one of the students living at 39 Guerrero Street. Fuchs told Swanson about Blyton and invited him home for a meeting. Within a week, the young Midwesterner was helping the household move to larger accommodations a few blocks away at 20 Steiner Street. By March of 1969, Swanson was an ordained priest on his way back to Chicago to open the Order's second mission station. In another case, an East Coast emigre named Martha Morabito had run afoul of drugs and poor health and was wandering the streets as a penniless vagrant when she was taken in by the Steiner Street community. Though at first scornful of the house's daily regimen, she began volunteering in the kitchen, and by September 1968 had been ordained as the Order's second woman priest. Bill Canwright, in a third instance, was living in Buena Vista Park at the Haight's West End when two brothers found him one chilly, rainy evening and invited him home. He was soon wearing a black clerical suit and studying for his priestly ordination, which took place in August 1968. The Steiner Street apartment was situated next to the tough Fillmore and Mission districts, an ideal placement for the community's street patrols. The neighborhood was not, however, the most quiet of locations for a contemplative community. The quaint streetcars of the North Judah line lumbered along DuBose Street on the building's south side, and fire engines with their sirens wailing raced out of a nearby station at all hours of the day and night. The property itself, which had been leased for $450 a month, consisted of 3 floors of large flats and an unfinished basement. Blyton's office and sleeping quarters, which would become the scene of legendary conversions, healings, and initiations, was in 2 second-floor rooms that faced DuBose Park across the street. Although the former tenants, members of the psychedelic troupe the Merry Pranksters, had left it badly in need of repair, the apartment was soon restored to a livable condition. In an effort to engender neighborhood trust and avoid misunderstanding should his students be questioned during their nightly patrols, Blyton registered their names at the local police precinct. The community's training at this point consisted of street patrols, evening classes, homiletic training on Sunday afternoons, and special concentration exercises. One of these exercises entailed reading a chapter from the New Testament and then writing it out in the students' own words. Its purpose was to help fix the text of the New Testament in the student's mind and to cultivate mental discipline in those who had dropped out of formal educational institutions. To familiarize his students with the world's diverse religious traditions, Blyton took them on tours of local churches and temples and invited representatives from other spiritual movements to lecture. Among the local teachers who came to talk were the Sufi Murshid Samuel Lewis, the Theosophist Joe Miller, the Zen author Paul Reps, the Russian Orthodox Bishop Warwick Pemchenko, and a Mormon elder. In early 1968, the I Thou coffee shop on Haight Street, which had been a popular venue on the peak of the Summer of Love, was ready to close because of the neighborhood's deteriorated condition. When the shop's owner offered Blyton a favorable lease, he decided that the location could provide a quiet oasis from the street's chaos and readily agreed to terms. The newly refurbished Brother Juniper's Inn opened its doors a short time later and quickly gained a favorable reputation for its healthful snacks, classical music, exhibitions by local artists, and contingent of cheerful brown-robed monks. Blyton instituted a strict policy of non-proselytization in the coffee shop, but the brothers were available for counseling and other aid. By mid-1968, the budding movement was attracting a steady rate of new members, mainly through word of mouth. Blyton spent long hours in his Steiner Street office, patiently explaining his teachings to curious visitors. One of these inquirers was Stephen Gaskin, who would later go on to create the Farm Commune in rural Tennessee. Gaskin had begun a series of highly popular Monday evening rap sessions in a rented ballroom on Haight Street. These talks were a rambling synthesis of psychedelic mysticism, Zen Buddhism, reincarnationism, astrology, and tantrism, all delivered in impeccable hippie argot. Gaskin also organized Sunday morning sunrise gatherings on the hills of San Francisco, where he conducted large-scale charismatic healing rituals. During their long discussion, Blyton made no effort to recruit Gaskin, but did bless the younger man's work with counterculture dropouts in an evening initiatory ceremony. Blyton made another contact during this period that would have long-range consequences for his movement's charitable outreach. While procuring black suits in a Mission District thrift store, he was introduced to Ella Rigney, a 76-year-old Vista volunteer who was leasing the store on behalf of the Episcopal Church. Rigney, a native of New York State, where her father had founded the American Cancer Society, was a longtime social activist and service volunteer. The two elderly New Yorkers became staunch friends, and soon Rigney was sending boxes filled with black suits and dresses to the Brother House. She also introduced Blyton to local Episcopalian leaders. Within several years, the energetic social worker had become a novice in the Holy Order of Mans, and at the age of 85, the executive director of Raphael House, the movement's much heralded San Francisco homeless shelter. In June of 1968, Blyton's spirit guides told a new student, "Your real biblical personality, the reality of your being, is one of note. You are Mary Magdalene, and were with the Master. And there are going to be several others here until the 12 have been accumulated. These 12 will become what you know as realized beings, part of the Great Brotherhood. Your jobs as women will not be an easy one, and you have been picked because you were with the Master when he was here. Both of us were members of the Essene Order at that time. Paul Blyton and I have been together many years. We have worked and traveled together." This short message contained the key components of the mythos that was to animate the Holy Order of Mans as a millenarian restorationist community during its founding period. In its essentials, this mythos asserted that central figures of the early Christian period, the apostles, Paul of Tarsus, Jesus' women followers, and members of the Essene sect had reincarnated in the 20th century and were seeking to recapitulate, through the work of the order, what they had accomplished during the first century, the preparation of humanity for a new spiritual dispensation. As a former member recounted, there was certainly the idea that the very leader of the order was the reincarnation of the Apostle Paul, coming back to do the same kind of work that he had done in the early centuries, and that other figures in the order were reincarnations of the apostles. In my youthful optimism, I thought I was the Apostle John, and this other fellow, whose name was James, that he was my brother, the sons of Zebedee. There was the sense of some linkage, some similarity with the work of the Essenes, preparing for the coming of the Christ. This innovative version of conventional restorationism was developed further in Blyton's writings and sermons over the following year. For example, in a 1969 sermon, he proclaimed, "There is a host of teachers that exist here now that come into this earth life, into even the dense earth form when needed, that have lived before and have seen many of the things that happened during the time of our Master. They can speak to us, those who have departed and who have been the great teachers and the apostles of our Lord." This mythos would prove to be a powerful motivator of member commitment and zeal throughout the order's history. As historians Richard Hughes and C. Leonard Allen have argued, the restorationist impulse, the desire to restore the purity and power of a sacred primordium, in this case the primitive Christian church, has been a central feature of American life and thought from the earliest Puritan settlements, and now continues to exercise a profound influence on the thinking and behavior of the American people. For NRMs such as the Mormons and the Disciples of Christ, who were attempting to establish their legitimacy in the confusion of 19th century America's pluralistic religious environment, the claim to be a reproduction of the ancient apostolic order was tantamount to a self-anointing as the one true church, a religious community that transcended time and was thus superior to the historic tradition-laden churches. The Holy Order of Mans was to fall profoundly under the spell of this illusion of innocence, though the group's version of restorationism would change significantly between 1968 and 1988. Earl Blyton had come a long way since his near physical and mental collapse in 1963. He had established himself in San Francisco as a charismatic and respected teacher of Western esotericism, whose creative assemblage of mystical practices and initiatory rites appealed to the city's experience-hungry counterculture. He had also gathered around him a core of committed followers who were inspired by his vision of a new age of planetary illumination and by the opportunity he offered them to join in the vanguard of this millennial dispensation. Within his circle of students, Blyton had successfully created a role for himself as mystagogue and revelator, and had begun building a disciplined monastic order to carry out the urgent initiatory work he believed the times warranted. Finally, the retired electrical engineer had provided a socially constructive outlet through organized charity work on the streets of San Francisco for a subpopulation of 1960s American youth in search of a more altruistic way of life than that offered by the prevailing ethos of economic self-advancement. As the youths who had flooded the streets of the Haight throughout 1967 and early 1968 began searching for an escape from the surrounding chaos, Blyton's order would be one of many new religious movements prepared to receive them.